Children to digest, I would imagine.
I love Brussels sprouts.
So do I.
Yeah, why wouldn't you? They're good for you.
I was force-fed them as a child.
Poor Sally.
Haven't eaten them since.
Let's not go into your abuses. Shall we talk? Let's discuss more with Alpesh Patel from Profenium Partners. Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Talking about abuses and pressure to digest things that perhaps you don't want. Mr. Draghi, see that?
What a link from Brussels sprouts to...
Anyway, the ECB is obviously meeting later today, and the banks are begging for help. And the ECB looks as if it might offer a bit of help here.
Well, yes, except, you see, they're facing the same problem that everybody else is when money doesn't circulate the system, which is, would they be throwing good money after bad? That's one concern that they have, which is why people don't move money around. And that's why the banks are in the problem they're in to begin with, because they can't access dollars from the Americans who feel that, well, if the euro breaks down, do we really want to be giving money to banks? At the same time, the banks themselves are hoarding cash in euros at the ECB because they're thinking, we don't know what's going to happen. Essentially, people are not moving money around, and none of them want to take the risk either, and that's what the ECB is trying to solve, that political problem.
So it's a credit crunch, isn't it? Would you say?
It's a credit or liquidity crunch, yes. People don't want to undertake transactions, but the fundamental problem is that the ECB is willing to buy bonds only if they're assured there'll be political reform. But it's not political reform. They need cultural reform, and by that I mean you need a whole load of people to stop taking siestas in the afternoon, work harder and work longer.
That's a long-term issue, though, isn't it?
It is, and that's
they're trying. Across Europe, we've seen austerity measures, increasing working hours, increasing pension ages, but this is going to take years, and something needs to be done now.
And let's just say as well, just to make the point, that, you know, those that take siestas, they just work longer in the day, don't they? They finish their day later. Shops are open later. They might shut in the middle of the day.
To suggest that certainly from GDP per capita of countries which do tend to take siestas.
I know it's a bit of an argument debate, but just in the defence of those that take a nap.
Listen, I'm all for siestas. My view is there's a cultural change which needs to occur in the Mediterranean economies because GDP per capita isn't as strong as it is in other parts.
But the ECB can't wait for a cultural change, can it?
I mean, it
has to act now.
That's the fundamental problem. It's got to undertake short-term action based on a long-term hope. And so what they're saying is we want to see political changes, whereas, as I say, it's cultural changes they need, and they need assurances. Essentially, they're ultimately going to have to trust, can you believe it? They're going to have to trust the people to work harder and pay their taxes.
But essentially, everything needs to happen, doesn't it? There needs to be the political consensus, i.e., you know, the agreement on plans, the ECB doing its bit, and the people doing their bit. It's kind of a team effort, isn't it?
I think we'll end up...
not one or the other.
And I think we'll end up doing what we always do in Europe. We'll fudge it. What we'll do is we'll say, yes, we trust them to make the changes sometime in the long term, and we'll give the money in the short term, and we'll make it somebody else's problem, but at least it won't be our problem this year. And that's what will ultimately end up happening. They will provide the capital because they'll have immense pressure put upon them to provide the capital. Let's
bastardize a quote from George Orwell. Some nations are becoming more equal than others. And Germany is doing rather well politically, shall we say, or at least being seen as a power.
Absolutely. Well, it's a very large economy. It's got money to throw around, and with money, of course, comes influence. But if you were to compare the United States of Europe, to use Winston Churchill's quote, the United States of Europe with the United States of America, then Greece is the equivalent of Washington State in terms of economic size. Italy is the same as California, both of which are pretty much bankrupt anyway. So what's the problem with these European states having so much political influence and difference in the same way the American states do? I think Germany is about the equivalent in terms of political influence of, say, a New York, and Britain, which is what the story talks about as being a periphery, and I don't mind being a periphery if the cost of influence is being part of the euro at the moment. I don't mind being a periphery. It's probably more like a Florida. Now and again we'll call the shot, but you know, at the heart of the matter at the moment, yes, it's the Germans.
We haven't got the beaches. I'm sorry, I don't agree with you. We're not a Florida. We haven't got the climate, we haven't got the beaches. But it's an interesting one, and it does sort of illustrate in a way, doesn't it?
And there's nothing wrong with it.
How, you know, the chess game is changing and Germany's becoming ever more powerful, but it will be interesting to see how the likes of David Cameron and other leaders who are outside the Eurozone will fight their corner this weekend.
I think it's very good in terms of, you're absolutely right, with the summit happening this weekend. I think it's actually very good for Britain that we're not right at the forefront and at the centre of Europe at the moment, because the mess that's been created hasn't been Britain's mess as such. You can say we're all responsible to some extent.
The issue, isn't it, is whether, you know, the UK sort of is a helping hand to resolving this crisis, or whether the UK tries to look after itself and prove to be difficult,
the best
like
way for
Angela
Britain to
Merkel
be
and Nicolas Sarkozy.
the best way for Britain to be an influence is not by simply having some notional seat at a table and saying, look, we're important as well on a photo shoot. It's the fact that we're the 4th largest economy in the world in Britain, and that's the best way that we're helping Europe, is that we're the largest trading partner with the Eurozone countries.
Easy for you to say, though, as you know, but when, you know, for the likes of David Cameron, who's got, obviously, within his own party, very strong voices,
Absolutely.
and he's part of a coalition government, and he's part of the European Union.
When has a Conservative leader not had a problem with their right flank over Europe? And he'll handle it, and I think he's handling it incredibly well, actually.
We need to move on. Iran, this virtual American embassy, this is an interesting move by the United States. Well, the paper's saying it's seen as almost some diplomacy here, but Iran's having none of it.
No, they've set up this, as you say, this online embassy so that they can pump the voice of America. And what, if you're Iranian, you're going to say propaganda. If you're an American, you're going to say public diplomacy. Now, I'm not a spokesman for Satan, and they've said it's the great
Good
Satan.
Job too, Alpesh.
Of course, I would say that, wouldn't I? They've said the great Satan's deception at having a virtual embassy has been foiled. But what I'd say to the people of Iran is, come join us in democracy and capitalism. Just read our newspapers, how wonderfully attractive it is. Why block the news stories about capitalism? I'm sure it's something which will sell itself to them and doesn't need Americans to sell it for them.
What do you make of the China Daily story here?
China Daily, nuclear pact, nuclear discussions between China and the US. Now, this is not an alliance, of course. They're just having discussions between each other. There's 2 strategic alliances going on here. There's the Chinese string of pearls strategy, which is supposed to go from the South China Sea, South China Sea towards the Indian Ocean and circle India and Southeast Asia, versus the US, Australia, India encirclement, and they're trying to outdo each other, a little bit like wrestlers trying to get the upper hand. And I suppose a sort of a male sport analogy is a good one for this. The Americans don't have the money for this kind of spending. The Chinese do. So ultimately it will be the Chinese that win in this, because the Americans will not be able to outspend them.
It's quite funny because the story just below that one is about Bill Gates founding a company that's going to help China develop its nuclear industry. It's quite interesting, isn't it?
Well, it certainly needs...
You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course the Americans trade massively with the Chinese, and I think it'll be good actually that they're not having, of course, this defense war, because both incredibly entrepreneurial nations, and if they could just focus on trading instead of building armaments, a lot of which are just obviously sunk costs, then I think they'll end up doing far better. So I think it's actually advantageous that the Americans don't have huge sums of money to start a defense war or a Cold War.
America and China both highly criticised actually when it comes to climate change and how much effort they're putting in to make a deal. And the UN of talks obviously in Durban at the moment. Do you have any faith in anything coming out of this that's positive?
No, if I was there I would enjoy the sun, and we're going to get a lot more sun because they're not going to agree to a climate change policy on this. And one of the reasons for that is the Chinese and the Americans were never part of Kyoto 1, and in terms of Kyoto 2, when Kyoto 1 runs out in 12 months, is that the Japanese and the Russians and the Canadians have already jumped ship, so you're left with the EU. And they seem to have their hands full, and the EU have seemed to make it clear that they're not going to be signing up if nobody else is. So just enjoy the sun, get a nice tan.
Okay, would you have Brussels sprouts in the
I
sun?
love them. I absolutely love them.
And you're not a fan?
Christmas Day we won't be having any, I don't think.
Okay, well there are plenty coming along. There's a bumper crop. Alpesh, always a pleasure having you with us. Thank you very much. From Sally and myself, more to come, but for the moment it's goodbye for now.
Bye-bye, see you soon.